He stood in the saloon doorway, tall as a pine and rough as bark. Dust clung to his boots, and the wind that followed him inside carried the scent of mountain air and pine smoke. His broad shoulders filled the entrance, blocking the fading light of late afternoon. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he cleared his throat, his voice deep and steady. "I need a wife," he said. "By tomorrow." The room erupted with laughter. It was not cruel laughter at first, but the startled kind that rises when something unexpected breaks the rhythm of an ordinary day. Men leaned against the bar, grinning into their whiskey glasses. A woman near the piano covered her mouth as she laughed. Someone muttered that the mountain had finally driven him mad. The bartender poured a drink without being asked, sliding it across the counter with a sympathetic nod. The man did not laugh. He did not move. He simply stood there, patient and unmoving, like a tree that had weathered too many storms to be shaken by noise. Welcome to Shadow of the West. Subscribe and ring the bell for more legendary tales of love, courage, and the untamed frontier. The Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1874 was a land that stripped men of pretense. Out here, dignity was a luxury few could afford. Survival came first, then shelter, then food. If a man was fortunate and stubborn enough to endure the winters without losing his fingers or his spirit, perhaps he might earn something resembling a life. Dignity, if it arrived at all, came quietly, without applause, and without anyone noticing except the man who had earned it. The town of Aspen Bend rested in a valley where the river curved gently eastward. The mountains rose on three sides like silent guardians, their peaks already dusted with the promise of early snow. It was a small town, made of determination more than timber. A general store, a livery stable, a church that served as a courthouse on Tuesdays, and a schoolhouse that opened only when enough children could be gathered from distant homesteads. And at the center of it all stood the saloon, where whiskey and opinion were served in equal measure. Perhaps 60 families lived within riding distance of Aspen Bend. They were cattle people, wheat people, timber people, and those who were simply surviving people. Most had come west chasing dreams. Many stayed because returning east meant admitting failure, and the frontier did not forgive failure. Josiah Cade rode into Aspen Bend on a Thursday afternoon in October, and he came down from the mountain slowly, reluctantly, like a creature leaving its natural home for unfamiliar ground. At 41, he was tall in the way. Certain trees are tall, not graceful, simply upward. His body had been shaped by years of mountain work, broad shoulders, slightly rounded from swinging an axe and leaning into the wind. His hands were scarred and calloused, darkened at every joint, more tool than flesh. His beard hung thick and uneven, the color of rusted iron, trimmed only when it began to catch on branches. His hair fell past his collar, cut roughly with a knife. His face was not handsome by any civilized measure. It was a working face, lined by weather and time. His nose bent slightly to the left, the memory of an old accident. Only his eyes told a different story. They were pale blue, clear as high mountain sky, yet gentle in a way that seemed misplaced behind such a rugged exterior. For 16 years, Josiah had lived alone in a cabin high above Aspen Bend. He trapped and hunted, cut timber, and traded supplies twice a year with as little conversation as possible. He was not unfriendly. He was simply unused to company. But he had not come to town for supplies. He had come because of 2 children. 3 weeks earlier, he had found them on a narrow mountain road 8 miles above Aspen Bend. A wagon stood still beside the trail, its horses restless but tethered. Inside lay their parents, taken by fever. Outside sat a boy and a girl, brother and sister. The boy, 7 years old, held his arm protectively around his 5-year-old sister. The girl clutched a rag doll with a single button eye. Neither child cried, and they had passed beyond tears into a silent stillness, too heavy for their young hearts. Josiah had brought them home without hesitation. He fed them venison and bread. He gave them his bed and slept on the floor beside the fire. He told them they were safe, though he did not know what safety meant for children who had lost everything. Each morning he promised himself he would figure out what to do. Each morning he failed, and so he fed them again. The boy's name was Gabriel. He spoke little but watched everything with solemn eyes. The girl's name was Lily. She had not spoken a word since Josiah found her. She spoke instead through her rag doll, pointing it at what she needed and holding it close when she was afraid. Each night she placed it on Josiah's knee before bed, her quiet way of saying goodnight. Or Josiah came to Aspen Bend because Judge Whitfield was arriving the next day. The territorial judge rode his circuit 4 times a year, settling disputes and deciding matters of law. According to the trading post owner, the judge would determine the children's future. But there was a problem. A single man could not be granted custody. The law required a married couple, a proper home, and a woman's presence. Without it, the children would be sent east on the orphan trains, placed in institutions where frontier children were processed without regard for their hearts. "You need a wife," the trading post owner had told him plainly. "I do not have a wife," Josiah replied. "Then you had better find one by tomorrow morning. The judge arrives at 10. And so Josiah stood in the saloon doorway, facing the laughter of strangers, with the future of 2 children resting on his words. The laughter slowly faded as he spoke again, his voice steady and honest. "Please," he said. "There are 2 children, a boy and a girl. They lost their parents on the mountain road. I have cared for them for 3 weeks. The judge comes tomorrow. If I do not have a wife, they will be taken, sent east." Silence fell over the room. "I am not asking for love," Josiah continued. "I am not asking for forever. I am asking for a woman willing to stand beside me in front of a judge so 2 children do not lose the only home they have left." No one spoke. The clock ticked softly against the wall. Glasses remained untouched in trembling hands. The laughter that had filled the room moments earlier now felt distant and hollow. Then, from the back of the saloon, and a chair scraped quietly against the wooden floor, a woman stood up. The woman walked forward slowly, her footsteps soft against the worn wooden floor. Every eye in the saloon followed her, the room holding its breath as if afraid to disturb the moment. She was not dressed to draw attention. Her plain blue dress was simple, neatly pressed but modest. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face marked not by beauty alone, but by quiet endurance. She stopped a few feet from Josiah Cade and looked up at him. He was taller than any man in the room, yet there was no fear in her gaze, only calm understanding, and something deeper that few could name. "My name is Edith," she said gently. "I have one question." Josiah nodded, his voice low but steady. "Ask it." The room leaned closer, the silence now heavy with expectation. Will you be kind to them?" The words fell softly, but they carried through the saloon like thunder. Every man and woman in the room felt their weight. She had not asked about money, land, or comfort. She had not asked about his past or his future. She had asked the only question that mattered. Josiah looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing the first clear light after a long winter. His pale blue eyes softened, and when he spoke, his voice trembled with truth. "I will be kind to them," he said. "I have been kind to them for 3 weeks. I fed them when I did not know how to care for children. I held the little girl when she cried in her sleep. I taught the boy to stack firewood because he wanted to help. I do not have money. I do not have manners. I cut my own hair with a knife. But I will be kind to them, and to you, but every day, as long as you will allow it." Edith studied his face, not the scars or the rough beard, but his eyes. She saw no falsehood there, only honesty and a quiet strength shaped by years of solitude and hardship. A faint smile touched her lips, small and private, like the first bloom of spring after a long winter. "Then I will marry you, Mr. Cade," she said. The saloon erupted, not with laughter this time, but with relief. Smiles spread across faces that moments before had been filled with doubt. The bartender raised his glass. Mrs. Calloway, who had quietly entered during the exchange, wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. Something beautiful had just taken place, and everyone knew they had witnessed a moment worth remembering. The wedding took place the next morning in the small church that doubled as a courthouse. Judge Whitfield stood at the front, his spectacles resting low on his nose as he conducted the ceremony with practiced efficiency. Frontier justice wasted no time. Gabriel stood beside Josiah, clutching the ring Mrs. Calloway had generously offered from her own jewelry box. Lily stood beside Edith, holding her rag doll tightly against her chest, as if presenting it for approval. The judge completed the ceremony and reviewed the custody papers in one seamless motion. When he looked up, he saw more than a legal arrangement. He saw a family. "With this union," Judge Whitfield said, his voice firm but warm, "custody of the children is hereby granted." Josiah exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding. Edith placed her hand gently over Lily's, and for the first time since her parents' passing, the little girl's eyes shone with quiet comfort. They rode back to the mountains that afternoon, the wagon moving steadily along the winding trail. Josiah held the reins, Edith seated beside him. Gabriel and Lily sat in the back, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. The journey was quiet, but not empty. It carried the promise of something new, something fragile, yet strong. When they reached the cabin, Edith stepped down from the wagon and stood still, studying the place that would now be her home. It was rough and simple, built by hands that understood survival more than comfort. But it was solid, warm, and surrounded by towering pines that whispered gently in the wind. "It needs curtains," she said at last. Josiah blinked in surprise. "I do not own curtains." "You do now," Edith replied softly. I brought fabric." She had prepared for this life before she ever spoke her question. Inside the cabin, she unpacked her small belongings. A Bible, a few carefully folded dresses, and a photograph of her son, which she placed quietly on the mantel. Josiah never asked about it. Some things, he understood, required no explanation. Days turned into weeks. Edith brought warmth and order to the cabin with quiet determination. Curtains appeared at the windows. Meals filled the table with comforting scents. The house, once silent and lonely, began to breathe with life. One cold November afternoon, Lily sat beside Edith as she sewed by the fire. The little girl placed her rag doll gently on Edith's knee and looked up with wide, searching eyes. "Mama," she whispered. The word filled the cabin with light. Edith's hands stilled, and her breath catching as emotion surged through her. Slowly she gathered Lily into her arms, holding her close. Tears shimmered in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of healing. Josiah stood quietly in the doorway, witnessing the moment that transformed his cabin into a true home. The seasons passed gently after that. Gabriel grew stronger, learning the mountains at Josiah's side. Lily's laughter filled the cabin from morning until night. And each evening, as the fire crackled softly and the stars appeared above the silent peaks, Edith would ask the same simple question. "Were you kind today?" Josiah would nod, his voice steady and sincere. "I tried." She would smile, and peace would settle over their home like a blessing. Spring arrived gently in the mountains above Aspen Bend, yet melting the last traces of winter from the high ridges and filling the valley with the soft green promise of new life. The cabin that once stood silent now hummed with warmth and laughter. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney, and the scent of fresh bread often drifted through the pine trees, carried on the mountain wind. Josiah Cade stood outside one morning, splitting firewood beneath the clear Wyoming sky. Gabriel worked beside him, his small hands steady as he stacked each piece carefully against the west wall. The boy had grown stronger over the months, his quiet confidence shaped by the steady presence of the man he now called father. "Papa, where should I put this one?" Gabriel asked, holding up a piece of timber nearly as long as his arm. Josiah paused, resting the axe against the chopping block. For a moment, and he simply looked at the boy. The word still felt new, like sunlight after a long winter. It carried weight, responsibility, and a quiet joy he had never expected to know. "Against the west wall," Josiah replied, his voice calm and steady. Gabriel nodded and placed the wood exactly where it belonged. The task was simple, but the bond between them was strong, built not on words, but on trust and shared work beneath the open sky. Inside the cabin, Lily's laughter filled the air like birdsong. She had found her voice and used it freely, chattering about everything she saw, everything she dreamed, everything she felt. Edith moved about the kitchen with gentle grace, her hands busy kneading dough, while Lily followed close behind, her rag doll tucked under one arm. The little girl paused near the window, sunlight warming her face. "Mama," she said softly, her voice full of certainty and love. Edith turned at once, her eyes shining. Each time Lily spoke that word, it healed a piece of her heart she thought had been lost forever. She wiped her hands on her apron and lifted the child into her arms, holding her close as if anchoring herself to the present. "You are growing so fast," Edith whispered, pressing a kiss to Lily's hair. Josiah watched from the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He had come inside to bring more wood for the fire, but he lingered, unwilling to disturb the quiet beauty of the moment. He had built the cabin with his own hands, but Edith had turned it into a home. Her kindness had filled every corner, steady and unwavering, like the mountains that surrounded them. Years passed, and marked by the turning of seasons and the quiet rhythm of frontier life. Josiah added another room to the cabin, knowing that families needed space to grow. Edith planted a garden that flourished against all odds, her careful hands coaxing life from the rugged mountain soil. Gabriel grew tall and capable, learning to navigate the forests and rivers as naturally as Josiah once had alone. Lily's laughter echoed through the valley, bright and free, no trace of the silent child she had once been. The town of Aspen Bend never forgot the evening Josiah Cade walked into the saloon asking for a wife. They told the story often, around fires and over cups of coffee, their voices warm with pride and humility. They remembered the laughter, though they were never proud of it. But they remembered it because it made the silence that followed more powerful, and the question that ended it unforgettable. Edith kept the blue dress she had worn that night, carefully folded in the wardrobe beside Josiah's worn coat. 2 simple garments, hanging side by side, told a story greater than any words could express. Their love had not begun with promises or romance. It had begun with courage, kindness, and a question asked in a quiet voice. She never told Josiah she loved him first, and he never said the words aloud either. They did not need to. Love existed between them the way the mountains stood around their home, steady, enduring, and unquestioned. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and the sky turned gold and violet, Edith would ask him the same question she had asked on the day their lives changed forever. "Were you kind today?" Josiah would pause, considering the day's work, the small moments that mattered, the quiet choices that shaped their lives. "I tried," he would answer, and Edith would smile, her eyes soft with understanding. That is enough. Some stories are remembered for grand gestures and dramatic declarations. But this story is remembered for something smaller and far more powerful. It is remembered for a question asked by a quiet woman no one had noticed, and an answer given by a man the town had laughed at. It is remembered for 2 children who lost everything and found it again in a cabin high in the mountains, built by scarred hands and filled with gentle hearts. The town had laughed when he asked for a wife. But one woman's question silenced everyone and changed 4 lives forever. And on the frontier, where survival was never guaranteed, kindness proved to be the greatest strength of all.